The Australian Financial Review.
Hello, I'm James Thomson, Senior Chanticleer columnist at the AFR. Welcome to our weekly news breakdown of all things business, finance and markets. With me today, as always, is my Chanticleer colleague and the barbarian of the budget, Anthony Macdonald. Anthony, how are you?
Good, James, and I come with a surplus of things to talk about.
Fantastic. Well, this week we give the Chook verdict on the corporate winners and losers from the budget. We try to make sense of the AI revolution, and we look ahead to next week's crucial economic data point. But first, Anthony, I wanted to ask you about your trip to the UBS trading floor, which is the biggest in the country. Your piece on this visit has attracted huge interest on the AFR website. And I was particularly struck by the fact that no one on the trading floor works from home. This week I've been struck down with a fairly mild case of COVID, and I've been stuck at home, and frankly it's killing me. So I'm very jealous of the team at UBS though. Tell us a little bit about the secret with the carpet at the UBS trading floor.
Yeah, James, this was such a rare look at the trading floor. I mean, I think I've been covering investment banks for 15 years and I've only seen 2 trading floors. There's so much going on, and these banks and brokers are so averse to letting anyone into the trading floor, for regulatory reasons. There's client confidential information. I think most importantly, there's just billions of dollars at risk as well, right? Like if these traders hit the wrong button or do the wrong thing, it can be a really bad outcome for the bank, and everyone loses their jobs here basically. But anyway, yeah, I loved seeing it. It was basically just like a busy office. And like you say, everyone at their desk. If you're not on your desk, you don't really exist in the world of a trading floor. You have to be there. You have to be, well, for most roles, you have to be there. You have to be calling your clients. Yeah, and as for the carpet, there's 2 shades of carpet. And when you first walk in, they don't really mean anything to you, but it quickly got explained to me. So if you're on the dark carpet, you're technically on the trading desk. You're on the tools. And you're only allowed to sort of use your work phone, your work email, and all that sort of stuff. And if you're on the light carpet, you're off the desk and you're allowed to use your mobile phone and take calls. And it's all sort of wrapped up in regulations and set up for regulatory reasons. But the guy showing me around, this guy who runs the UBS trading floor here, Mike Hendry, he's only new to the job. And he was a real surprise packet. He was a bond salesman, a surf ski paddler, never done an interview before in his 29 years at UBS. But he was so generous with his time, and he was quite thoughtful. And it was just great to see it.
Yeah, well, it's you've probably scarred him for life now, Anthony. But it was a great piece, and I really encourage people to have a read of that. Just on the working from home thing, there's a few other things I've noticed in our paper this week. We had a survey yesterday showing 40% of people said that working from home has a negative effect on them. We had a Melbourne entrepreneur from Luxury Escapes, a guy called Adam Schwab, saying he's mandated 4 days a week in the office, unless you're a carer, which, he's happy to make an exception for those people. And I think you had a similar message from Robert Milner, who's the patriarch, I guess, of Washington H. Soul Pattinson.
Yeah, that's right. He said if you work at Soul Pattinson and you want to work from home, you don't have a job. He expects all his staff to come in. So, yeah, it feels like the tide's definitely turning. But then again, on the sidelines at Saturday Sport, I'm still surprised at the number of people who work out there in corporate Australia or, NBN Co or whatever, who are working from home, 3 days a week.
Yeah, it's interesting, though. We've got so much focus on the world of commercial real estate and will the office market ever come back? So there's a push, I guess, from certain groups, certain CEOs to get people back. And then, as you say, there's a lot of actual workers who are pretty happy with the flexibility. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And just quickly, James, we should mention the big deal of the week, the $15 billion merger of ASX-listed lithium producer Allkem with a US rival called Livent. Now, tell us what's going on with this one.
Yeah, this was an interesting deal. The lithium market's obviously been hot for a long time. The last 18 months, we've seen prices soar and then fall back a bit. But this is a deal that's being driven by more, I think, the long-term green revolution. So these two companies can see that governments are incentivizing electric car makers and battery makers to do things locally. Governments want these things as supply chains around the world sort of break up. They want these businesses to be close to their home base. And so Livent and Alchem are getting together so they can service that market. They're going to have hubs in Australia, in Argentina, in Canada, even some production facilities in China, so they can work with different customers in their home bases. So this goes to this idea that not only have we got this sort of green energy transition revolution going on, but we've also got this fight for critical minerals. Everyone wants them in their own backyard. The forces of globalization are fading. So an interesting deal, and a good Australian flavour. Well, this company is going to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It will have a secondary listing in Australia, but it will retain an Australian chairman in Peter Coleman, who used to run Woodside Energy. And Anthony, he's pretty well known in local deal-making circles. So that'll be a link back home.
Yeah, he's extremely well known. I think like the other thing about this deal is it makes sense just from a purely financial markets perspective. These lithium sort of producers trade at a richer multiple in the US. So if you own Allchem here, they'll be hoping that they instantly get an uplift in the valuation just because, their primary listings in the US.
Yeah, they're going to push to be included in US indices. And as you say, that's the sort of hub where they understand the EV market a lot better. So I think it's a bit of a loss for Australian capital markets, but if you're Allchem and Livent, there's not really a lot of choice, is there?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, let's move on to the first big topic of the week. And the dreaded Rona meant that I couldn't get to Canberra as planned, but you bravely stepped up to enter the Sydney lockup and cover the federal budget from the Chook pen. Now, before we get into the substance of this, Anthony, tell us a little bit about what being in a budget lockup is like, because most of our listeners probably won't have been in one. So how does it actually work?
Yeah, well, it's also a can't work from home circumstance, as you found out.
Yes.
So, yeah, unfortunately, it was too late for me to go to Canberra by the time that's the corona struck yourself. But, yeah, so I did the Sydney lockup. In terms of the media, so we could either do a lockup in Canberra, which all our Canberra bureau did, or in Sydney. So a lot of the Melbourne people came up to Sydney as well. So there was a floor at work that was basically shut off to everyone. And in order to get into that floor, you had to sign a sort of confidentiality agreement saying that you wouldn't pre-release or pre-publish any information. So you get to the lockup at about midday, you sort of sit around for an hour and a half, they make sure your computer's sort of not connected to the network and that sort of thing. And then at 1:30, the budget papers drop. And then everyone's just sort of scurrying through these budget papers looking for tidbits of information. After about an hour, there was like a news conference with our team that were also in the lockup in Canberra that our big boss, Michael Stutchbury, was at. And us in Sydney, we kind of listened to Michael Stutchbury and Phil Curry, chief political reporter, sort of talk about the budget and what they thought. And then we're sort of sent to go and do our stories. So you're literally locked up till 7:30, not allowed out till 7:30. So yeah, and you follow your stories and then sort of it's just like a big exam. You're not allowed to you're not allowed to speak to anyone on the outside. So you don't really have a great flavour, to be honest, for what outsiders are going to think of the budget. It's all a judgment call.
Did you keep account of how many lolly snakes you ate during the, what is it, 5 hours?
Yeah, I got given a pack of lolly snakes to take home and got home and turns out the kids don't like lolly snakes. So that was the biggest disappointment of budget day for me.
Right. You ended up with a surplus of snakes.
There was a surplus of snakes. There was a surplus of all food, actually.
Excellent. Well, let's jump into the substance. And my sense with this budget from afar, Anthony, was that Treasurer Jim Chalmers sort of threaded the needle. Everyone was a little bit pleased with what they got and a little bit disappointed. There was relief for those doing it the hardest in this economy, more rent assistance, some help with power bills, more assistance for single parents, more money for healthcare, although we should stress that the vulnerable are still going to be doing it tough in what is a very inflationary environment. But as you wrote, there wasn't much for business outside a slightly sketchy plan around hydrogen.
Yeah, so there was some things for small business. So, I mean, they extended the instant asset write-off worth $20,000. There was help with small business power bills. But in terms of big business, there was bugger all. Despite the fact that business has paid plenty of company tax, over the past year, way more than expected. They came out of the budget with not much really. So it's funny because quite a few companies sort of wrote these submissions to the budget that went to Treasury early this year. And the Business Council of Australia, they did a 71-page submission. And I think big businesses walked away with not much at all. But yeah, there's one program that sort of instantly caught my eye as sort of the thing that would attract corporate Australia. And that was this hydrogen Head Start program worth $2 billion and which was a line or two in the budget. Like you said, it was very sketchy on details. In the fine print, it said the $2 billion would be spent from the period of next year to 2030 or even longer. And it said it was about helping get competitive hydrogen production contracts that bridge the gap for early projects, and that's it. So I spoke to as part of the lockup, you get the opportunity to ask Treasury for more details. So I went and spoke to the Treasury officials, and it turns out that it's all a sort of work in progress. They haven't decided what it looks like. They're still consulting with industry, but it looks like it's going to be some sort of underwriting guarantee or support for the early stage hydrogen manufacturers that they'll be able to sell their product at a certain price, which should help them get the confidence and the financing to set up these projects.
Yeah, that's the challenge in hydrogen. We don't have a market yet. No one really knows how to buy and sell this stuff. So people like Andrew Forrest, who have some big hydrogen plans, part of their challenge is actually just establishing the market and figuring out how the contracting is going to work and how the agreements are going to work. So if it seems like sometimes he's fumbling around a bit, that's because this is pretty, in a way, it's pioneering stuff. He's out there trying to figure out how an actual new market will work.
Yeah, there's no market, there's no product, there's no end use case yet, there's no customers. Like it's all evolving. But Andrew Forrest he's very firm on this. He's like, well, you've got to find out what the customers want, convince they need it, and then sort of backtrack from there to work out how you're going to produce it and make it all work. So, he's going around the world looking for customers essentially, and reckons he's got some buyers there. But anyway, we'll see.
Well, one of the things that was part of a lot of the submissions, pre-budget submissions from the likes of BHP, was we need to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is pouring money into green energy projects, critical minerals, the stuff that's driving that Alchem merger that we talked about before. The hydrogen plan is part of the response to that. Is it enough though, Anthony, or is there more coming here?
It's a very small part. In a budget when there was quite a bit dished out in terms of, little top-ups for people, I think those involved in the critical minerals industry and the renewable energy industry walked away disappointed that there wasn't more. But one thing that struck me, James, was if you look at the tax receipts and how much tax everyone's paying, the income tax, company tax, you consider the fact that unemployment's at 3.5%. I kind of walked out thinking, is this as good as it gets in terms of the revenue line for the budget? I mean, the company profits are still really strong, and we didn't really solve many big picture issues, did we? I mean, have we wasted an opportunity here?
It's an interesting question. One thing that struck me, there was a little box way down in budget paper 1, page 144, I think, for those playing at home. There was a box that talked about the aging of the population and what impacts that's having. So at the moment, the old age dependency ratio, which is the number of people over 64 per 100 people of working age, so 14 to 64, that's going to go from 27 to 31 over the next decade. So the number of taxpayers who can afford to help fund all the stuff we need to do in health and aged care and defence and welfare and all that sort of stuff, the number of taxpayers is falling. So, but nothing in the budget really addresses that, to your point. So I guess maybe Chalmers and Albanese are seeing this as a sort of narrative. So this budget, they get a surplus and they prove that they're credible economic managers, and we've seen that message repeated time and time again the last few days. And then the next budget is sort of a pre-election budget. They do a little bit more reform. They build up their economic management credentials a bit further, and then they'll hope to win government. And the budgets after that, perhaps that's when they'll tackle these bigger issues. You can sort of see that narrative in a longer-term conversation, and these are big long-term issues. So let's have a long-term conversation. That's good. But geez, you realise we don't have a lot of time to get on top of these things. And to your point, this could be as good as it gets if the economy turns down a bit.
Yeah, the problem there is the longer term conversation in the political cycle. That's 3 or 4 years. When people like you or I ask anyone in the street what long term means, everyone wants 10, 20, 30-year things, you know?
Yeah, like our super. Anthony, what do you think this budget means for inflation? This was the question, I guess, on the minds of economists, and poor old Philip Lowe at the RBA will have been watching this closely. Where do you think Jim Chalmers landed here?
I think it's pretty clear, and economists are quite unanimous. I mean, this doesn't stop inflation, right? So if you look at what the RBA is thinking about, price of goods going up, and then some of the supply side issues that it's looking at fiscal policy, like the government to sort out, like energy prices and rent, there's nothing really in there that's going to bring energy prices down or that's going to bring rents down, right? So I think there's a bit of good cop, bad cop going on here, right? So you've got the government knows the RBA is willing to be the bad cop, right? The RBA is an incredibly responsible institution for, everything that we've hauled it over the coals for in the past few years. They've shown as recently as 2 weeks ago that they're willing to lift rates when people on the street don't necessarily want them to. So they think the government knows that the RBA is going to keep doing its job. And it'll be the bad cop. So the government sort of feel free to look after a few more people. Yeah. But I mean, in saying that, hopefully inflation is going to come down either way. It's just a matter of how quickly.
Yeah, I think you're right. This probably the budget doesn't subtract from inflation, but I don't think it adds to it in a meaningful way either. So I think Chalmers has probably got it as right as he can. When you do give extra money out, that is inherently inflationary, but really he's not going to make that much difference. He has done the targeted relief. It's been pretty well thought through. So we'll see the next set of inflation numbers for the June quarter, and we'll have a better idea in a couple of months. All right, Anthony, winners and losers from a corporate perspective. Yep. You go first. Who'd you like here?
Yeah, everyone loves budget winners and losers. I think it was our most read story this week. From a business corporate perspective, anyone in GPs, right? So GPs, there's been a big extension of the Medicare rebate in GPs. So now there's going to be an increase in bulk billing for children, concession card holders, pensioners, and that's 11 million Australians. It's really surprising it's that many. So, I mean, Sonic Healthcare's got decent GP business. And then there's a few private equity-owned ones. BGH Capital's got one. Quadrant's got one called Fullerton. So I think basically making GPs more affordable for people should see more visits. There's already 200 million visits to GPs a year. Surely that's going up. So I think it should be good for the GP owners. What about you, James?
Yeah, I thought the first home buyer stuff was interesting. So the first home buyer guarantee scheme has been expanded. So any two people, including your sibling or your friend, can now purchase an eligible home with a 5% deposit. So that expands the scheme from basically spouses or partners doing it. That should be good for the likes of Stockland and Mirvac that sell house and land packages, particularly to first home buyers. And it should also be good for building materials companies like CSR and Boral, which makes cement and other sorts of products. I thought the migration stuff's important too. If you think of a very mature business like Coles or Woolworths, really their growth is dependent on the population just ticking up a little bit every year. So a boost to migration that helps the population tick up a bit faster should be good for them as well. So some winners and losers there, but as you said, Anthony, not too much excitement for business. We'll wait to see what happens over the next few budgets. The story will continue.
Yeah, I think it was an okay one for you to miss, James. Well, James, let's move to our second topic. And deep in the budget papers on Tuesday was a little note that said recent and rapid take-up of technologies like cloud computing, machine learning and artificial intelligence are now changing how we live and work. The nature of work is once again shifting, with new tools that allow workers to do more with less and new skills being demanded by businesses. Now, it was a good reminder for us that governments, just like business, are trying to get their heads around this massive trend.
Yes.
And James, you spoke to Commonwealth Bank boss Matt Common, boss of one of Australia's biggest companies this week. And how hot is this issue?
Well, he dialed in from the west coast of America. He's been over there seeing investors and bankers and colleagues and tech companies. We thought when he came online he'd be all ready to talk about US regional banks and how much trouble they're in. But what he said was that AI dominated every meeting he was in.
Wow.
And he's going to a conference at the end of this week in Seattle, the Microsoft CEO conference. Obviously, Commonwealth Bank would be a big customer of Microsoft, so Matt Common gets a Guernsey. But I think his point is that he expects this to be really well attended because everyone's trying to get their head around AI. His point was that he expects it could be a bit of the big get bigger type situation. Because AI is so expensive to develop, that'll mean that the leaders here are the big companies, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon. But I reckon the sort of secondary part of that is because AI is going to be expensive to deploy, I wonder if the people who lead the deployment in Australia will be the biggest companies like CBA or the big top end of the corporate spectrum. I'm not sure that we have a great sense yet of who's going to develop what and who are the winners and losers in this. It's still moving pretty quick. But Anthony, at the Macquarie conference last week, there was a session on how investors should think about spotting winners and losers. What was the advice there?
Well, the advice was basically what CBA is doing, and it's that don't treat AI like a sort of a product division or part of the tech department. Think about it as core to the company's strategy. So think about the company strategy as a whole, have people like Matt Common, the whole board, the whole executive team involved in these discussions, and think about, all right, what can AI do for us as a business as a whole first, and then think about how it fits into sort of certain streams underneath. So I think the investor crowd walked away from that saying, all right, when we're talking to Matt Common next, we need to ask him about it and not just think this is some tech issue over on the side. Because at the end of the day, setting up the business for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, AI is going to be pretty key.
Yeah, good way to think of it. Good way to think of it. I came across a couple of weeks ago a bit of academic research that had the occupations most at risk. It went through 774 occupations and tried to rank them in terms of their exposure.
Yeah.
At the bottom of the list was dancers.
Wow.
So they
Safe.
I'm not sure if you've thought of a new career there, Anthony, but might be too late to retrain. But at the top of the list was more interesting. So top of the list, telemarketers, people who work in call centers.
Yep.
8 of the top 10 places were different types of teachers.
Oh, wow.
There was a lot of legal sector workers, including judges. And you sort of think, hang on, how could you replace a judge or a mediator with AI? But when you think of that top 10, it's about industries and jobs where you're doing something to a formula based on established facts. Yeah. So if you're a teacher, you're teaching from a set text and a known group of facts. If you're a judge, you're using a known group of precedents based on hundreds of years of case law that everyone can see. Now, I would say that a judge needs to interpret that, and, obviously lawyers are great at picking out different precedents, but it is a reminder that some jobs that you think are safe might not be as safe as you think. I mean, I've been thinking a bit about, I'm sure you have too, fund managers and journalists, and we sort of think, well, there's a bit of skill in that,
Yeah.
Yes, the way one person interprets one fact could be entirely different from the way another person interprets it. But the sense I'm getting is that the intelligence in artificial intelligence is moving so quickly that some of these things where you think you're safe might not prove to be so safe after all.
Yeah, I think at the moment, like you say, it's anything that pulls together research, or big, case, big lists of case, established text, anything that is about bringing that knowledge together quickly and comprehensively, there could be a use case for it. And that's what Richard White, who founded WiseTech Global, $20 billion company. Richard White himself's worth $4 billion, and he's sort of one of the top Australian tech voices. That's what he's out there telling investors as well. He's using ChatGPT at the moment just personally for research purposes. But he says at the end of the day, you're always going to need that human overlay at the top just to make sure that what you make of that research is the right decision. Now, there may come a time when ChatGPT or AI is so good that it's guaranteed to make the right decision, but that's not where we are today.
Yeah, and to his point, even if you're not wiping out all the humans, you're probably still going to need fewer of them.
Oh, definitely.
In some sectors. and it'll be fascinating to see how it's going to play out. I think I think we're going to be coming back to AI time and time again on the Chanticleer podcast because it's just moving so quickly, Anthony.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, I think where we're going to see it adopted really heavily and maybe quite early is in the big consulting firms, the law firms, the accounting firms that are really a core audience for us here at the AFR. But these firms are already starting to think about how to use it. You know, they're technically big sort of jobs factories. They scoop up lots of graduates and they sort of train up graduates for the first few years. And for the first few years, you're not doing the most complicated work. You're just doing simple, ad checks on things or very much working to a formula. So I think these firms are thinking about how they can use some of this AI to do that work, but also worried about that, okay, if you do that and stop hiring grads, where does that leave the future of the business? So there's a real sort of balancing act going on out there in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Anthony. Well, speaking of balancing acts going on in the market, it's all about the macro at the moment. And next week we get another piece of key economic data that will give us a sense of where rates are coming. We'll look at that when we come back after the break. Okay, Anthony, budget week's over. We get back to the business of looking at companies and markets. We've got a few more results next week. A couple of big companies reporting: Xero, the accounting software business, and Aristocrat, the gaming machine maker. Should be interesting to see. That they'll give us a pretty good cross-section of the economy. Aristocrat particularly is in a number of different jurisdictions around the world.
Yeah, definitely. Aristocrat's a real powerhouse. A lot of fund managers own it in their portfolios here in Australia. Personally, I probably prefer to look at the Xero results. It's always interesting to see how this accounting software group is gaining traction in the US. And, if it really properly cracks that market, this business could be anything.
Yeah. And they've tilted recently, like all tech companies, away from growth and a bit more towards profitability. So that's an interesting balance too. We'll get the RBA minutes on Tuesday. Not sure there's any great mystery here, although we did have some RBA documents released under Freedom of Information laws yesterday, which showed that the bank has considered interest rates going to 4.8%. Were you a bit surprised by that? I mean, I guess this is what they should be doing, thinking about different scenarios.
Yeah, it was an interesting drop, wasn't it? It's sort of given us a different perspective on the whole RBA debate. But yeah, like you say, they should be considering these things.
Yeah. And finally, I think the big bit of data of the week is on Thursday, and that's local unemployment numbers. The rates tip to remain at 3.5%, so probably no movement. But this is the strange position that central bankers find themselves in, having done work so hard to make sure that unemployment was low. They now sort of need to see a little bit of a tick up in unemployment that will take a bit of heat out of the economy and help dampen inflation.
Yeah, that's the balancing act between interest rates and unemployment, isn't it? And I think unemployment's at 3.5%. Philip Lowe says that the full employment number, which is where sort of unemployment should be heading towards to, is in the 4%. So I mean, we're going to get back there. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah. One thing we picked up though from the bank reporting season, all the bank chief executives, Anthony, said that their discussions with business customers showed that they're still struggling for staff, particularly in some sectors. So the labour market's still tight. Yeah,
struggling for staff and then struggling to get somewhere for their staff to live in the case of if they're bringing people into the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you want to know more about what we're talking about today and a whole lot more, AFR subscribers can sign up to the Chanticleer Newsletter at join.afr.com/Chanticleer. Every Friday, the newsletter pulls together the best Chanticleer columns from the week and from the best insights from this podcast and delivers them straight to your inbox. And of course, we love questions here at the Chanticleer podcast. And this week, our question is from Michael Duffy from Melbourne, and it's an audio question.
Hi, James and Anthony. Michael from Melbourne here, loving the podcast. My question's in relation to sport, and in particular federal government funding into sport in this country over the next 10 years. This comes off the back of $250 million being allocated to support the build of the stadium in Hobart. Then in 2026, we've got the Commonwealth Games in Victoria, where $2.5 billion has been allocated. And then, of course, in 32, we've got the Olympic Games in Brisbane, where $7 billion has been allocated. That's a lot of money for one sector, when there's a lot of other areas out there that that need support at the moment as well. My question for the Chooks is this investment one we're going to be looking back on in 10 years' time as a wise investment and great for our country and the economy, or is this one we're going to be looking back on with regret? Keep up the great work, guys. Thanks.
A great question, Michael. It's a tough one. I mean, obviously there's a lot of pressures, as we've seen this week. There's a lot of pressures on the budget and a lot of inequities in the economy that sort of need to be addressed, and that's a difficult task. So you might look at this sports money and think, oh, that's wasted. I think the days of overspending on Commonwealth Games and Olympics infrastructure are probably gone. They're going to be much smaller scale affairs than in the past. A lot fewer permanent venues, and much more sensible use of existing infrastructure. So I think the cash that we need for these events will be lower than it would have been in the past. But there has been protests in Tasmania over the stadium for the new AFL team there this week. There's a huge social housing problem in Hobart, and pumping money into a new stadium has been controversial, which is totally fair enough. But I guess this has been a decision around the Tasmanian team that's been some decades in the making. So it's not a one-year issue, I guess. Anthony, what do you reckon? This is a tough balance to get right.
There's two issues here. So you've got spending on infrastructure, and then you've got spending on sport. So I think with when it comes to building new stadiums and putting money into new stadiums and the like, in my eyes, that's spending on infrastructure, and that's a good thing. Then separately to that, when there's Olympics coming up in Australia, the government has traditionally directed more funding into the funding of actual sport, into the AIS and into the various sport organisations to make sure we perform well at those Olympics, and that's kind of a separate matter. I mean, I'm all for directing money into sport. I think it's great for investment into the next generation of athletes. It inspires people. It's a big part of Australia's sort of cultural heritage, and I think it sends a good message to the next generation of kids that if they can have a healthy lifestyle and get involved in these things, then it's it'll can benefit them through life.
Yeah, good point. And hey, just thinking about it, professional athletes probably an occupation that's not going to be disrupted by AI too much either.
No, they're there with the dancers.
Very good. All right. Well, Anthony, well done at the budget this week, and thanks for stepping in and delivering the verdict from the Chook Pen. Another big week looms, and it's been great to chat. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, James, and good to see you recovering well.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. Well, if you like the podcast and you want to hear more, consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. And follow us wherever you get your podcasts. At The Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com and you can subscribe to The Financial Review, the daily habit of successful people, at afr.com/subscribe. Chanticleer was hosted by me, James Thomson, and Anthony Macdonald. The producers are Lap Fan and Alex Gow. Our theme music is by Alex Gow. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.